So we need to talk about this starter pack. And if you're here watching this, chances are you either are the starter pack or you know someone who definitely is. And honestly, there's no shame in that game. I stumbled across this meme the other day and it hit different, you know? Like, whoever made this basically took a screenshot of my entire personality between ages 19 and 23. And I'm willing to bet I'm not alone here. Look, we've all seen those starter pack memes, right? Usually they're pretty surface level. The girl who peaked in high school starter pack or whatever. But this one goes deep. This is like the philosophical awakening nobody asked for, but everyone gets anyway. So let's break this down piece by piece. Because honestly, understanding this might help some of us figure out why we spent our early 20s spiraling about the meaning of existence while wearing the same hoodie for 3 weeks straight.
The philosophers.
All right, let's start with the heavy hitters in the image. Camus, Nietzsche, and what looks like Sartre. The holy trinity of, oh God, what's the point of anything? Camus is probably your gateway drug into existentialism. You probably first heard about the absurd through some random YouTube video at 2 a.m. when you were supposed to be studying for finals, and suddenly you're reading The Stranger and relating way too hard to a guy who literally doesn't care about anything. Meursault becomes your spirit animal for like 3 months. Then there's the whole imagine Sisyphus happy thing, and you're sitting there like, wait, so the point is that there is no point, but we should be cool with it? Your mind gets blown for the first time by philosophy, and suddenly you're that person bringing up absurdism at parties. Fun times. Nietzsche hits different, though. This dude basically said God is dead and we killed him, and every 21-year-old who's ever had a religious crisis suddenly felt seen. The whole Übermensch concept makes you feel like maybe, just maybe, you could transcend all this meaningless suffering and become something more. Spoiler alert, you're still figuring out how to do laundry consistently, but the dream is there. And Sartre, hell is other people becomes your personal motto, especially after you've been stuck in group projects with people who don't read the assigned material. Being and nothingness sounds intimidating as hell, but you power through it anyway because suffering through dense philosophical texts somehow feels appropriate when you're questioning everything. But here's what nobody tells you about diving into existentialism at 21. It's simultaneously the most liberating and most terrifying thing ever. You realize you have complete freedom to create your own meaning, but also you have complete freedom to create your own meaning. That's a lot of pressure for someone who can barely decide what to have for breakfast.
The aesthetic.
Let's talk about that outfit situation. Black jeans, hoodie, the whole minimalist thing. There's something almost ritualistic about it, right? Like you strip away all the superficial stuff because you're focused on the big questions now. I swear there's a direct correlation between how deep you are in your existential crisis and how monochrome your wardrobe becomes. It's like you're unconsciously trying to match your inner void or something. Plus, when you're spending most of your mental energy wondering why anything matters, picking out clothes becomes this exhausting decision you'd rather just eliminate. The hoodie becomes like armor. It's comfortable, it hides you from the world when you need to disappear, and it's got that perfect combination of I'm too deep for fashion and I'm too depressed to care. We've all been there. And don't even get me started on the psychology of wearing the same thing every day. There's something weirdly comforting about eliminating choice when your brain is already overwhelmed trying to figure out your place in the universe. Steve Jobs knew what he was doing with that black turtleneck situation.
The coffee shop philosophy.
That coffee cup in the image? Yeah, that's not just about caffeine. Coffee shops become your second home during this phase. There's something about sitting alone, with your laptop, a cup of overpriced coffee, and a book by some dead German philosopher that just hits right. You become one of those people who camps out for hours, nursing a single drink while you annotate your copy of Being in Time. The baristas know your order by heart, but they have no idea you're over there having a complete mental breakdown about temporal existence. Coffee shops during existential crisis phase serve multiple purposes. They're public enough that you feel connected to humanity, but anonymous enough that you can process your thoughts without judgment. Plus, there's something romantic about the whole tortured intellectual aesthetic. You're basically cosplaying as a Parisian cafe philosopher, except you're at a Starbucks in suburbia. And let's be real, the caffeine helps. When you're staying up until 4 a.m. reading Kierkegaard and questioning everything you thought you knew about faith and existence, you need all the chemical assistance you can get. The creative attempts. Oh man, the guitar thing. This hits way too close to home. You pick up guitar thinking it'll be this deep, meaningful way to express all your existential angst. You imagine yourself as this brooding artist, playing melancholic melodies that capture the essence of human suffering. Reality check. Learning guitar is hard, and being bad at something when you're already feeling useless about everything else is just brutal. So you give up after a few weeks because you're not immediately good at it, and now the guitar just sits there, judging you every day. But it's not just guitar. This phase is full of half-started creative projects. You try to write poetry that captures the meaninglessness of existence, but it comes out sounding like bad emo lyrics. You attempt photography, thinking you'll document the beauty in mundane suffering, but your photos just look depressing, not profound. The creative urge during existential crisis is real, though. There's this desperate need to make something meaningful, to leave some mark that proves you existed and thought deep thoughts. The fact that most of these attempts fail just adds another layer to the crisis. Now you're not just questioning the meaning of life, you're questioning whether you have any talent worth developing. The social paradox. Wants to meet new people, but at the same time really doesn't want to meet new people. This might be the most accurate description of 21-year-old existential crisis mode ever written. On one hand, you're desperately lonely. You want connection, deep conversations about the nature of existence. Someone who understands why you spent 3 hours yesterday thinking about death and time and whether any of this matters. On the other hand, most people your age want to talk about normal things, their jobs, their relationships, what happened on some TV show. And you're over here like, but have you considered that we're all just atoms floating in an indifferent universe? It's isolating as hell. So you end up in this weird social limbo. You crave meaningful connection, but find small talk physically painful. You want to meet people, but you're also kind of elitist about it. They have to be the right kind of people. The ones who've also read Camus and understand why you sometimes just stare at walls for an hour. Dating during this phase is particularly brutal. Imagine trying to flirt when you're genuinely uncertain whether free will exists. Hey, want to grab coffee and discuss the inherent meaninglessness of human existence? Isn't exactly a pickup line that works on everyone. The smoking aesthetic. Smokes by himself. Yeah, this one's loaded. Smoking during existential crisis isn't really about nicotine addiction, though that might develop. It's about the ritual, the aesthetic, the way it makes you feel like you're in a French New Wave film. There's something almost meditative about stepping outside alone, lighting up, and just existing for those few minutes. It's a break from the overwhelming nature of consciousness. Plus, let's be honest, there's a whole romantic tragedy thing going on. You're slowly killing yourself while contemplating mortality. It's poetic in the most pretentious way possible. The smoking thing also fits into the broader pattern of self-destructive behavior that tends to accompany existential crises. When you're questioning whether anything matters, taking care of yourself can feel pointless. Why eat well, exercise, get enough sleep, when we're all just going to die anyway? Of course, this logic doesn't really hold up to scrutiny, but when you're 21 and everything feels meaningless, it makes sense in the moment. The media consumption. Let's talk about that media list. Evangelion, Joy Division, Pink Floyd, King Crimson. This is the starter pack for deep emotional processing through art. Neon Genesis Evangelion is basically required viewing for anyone going through it.
Here's a show that takes teenage angst and existential dread and wraps it up in giant robot fights and religious symbolism. Shinji's whole hedgehog's dilemma thing becomes your personal philosophy for a while. The show literally ends with the main character having a mental breakdown about existence and identity, and you're sitting there like, finally, someone gets it. Joy Division is the soundtrack to 3 a.m. existential spirals. Ian Curtis singing about isolation and alienation while you stare at your ceiling wondering what you're doing with your life. Love Will Tear Us Apart becomes an anthem, not because you're going through a breakup, but because it captures something about the impossibility of human connection that feels true when you're in this headspace. Pink Floyd's The Wall hits different when you're building your own psychological walls. The whole concept of alienation from society, from other people, from yourself, it's like Roger Waters read your diary. Comfortably Numb becomes a little too relatable. And then there are those random experimental films and obscure books you consume, not because you particularly enjoy them, but because suffering through difficult art feels somehow appropriate. You watch Tarkovsky films and pretend to understand them. You read Finnegan's Wake and give up after 30 pages, but tell people you're working through it.
The academic struggle. Here's something the starter pack doesn't show, but definitely should. The weird relationship with education during this phase. You're simultaneously the most intellectually curious you've ever been and completely unable to focus on your actual coursework. You'll spend hours reading philosophy that's not assigned for any class, but you can't bring yourself to write that economics paper that's due tomorrow. You're having profound thoughts about the nature of reality, but you're also failing your math class because numbers feel meaningless when everything feels meaningless. Professors don't know what to do with you. In literature classes, you're that student who always wants to discuss the existential implications of whatever you're reading. But in practical subjects, you're checked out completely. Why learn accounting when capitalism is probably just a social construct anyway? This creates this weird academic identity crisis on top of your regular identity crisis. You're smart, you know you're smart, but the traditional metrics of academic success suddenly feel arbitrary and pointless. The digital age twist. Something that makes the modern existential crisis different from previous generations is social media. You're having this profound personal crisis about meaning and identity, but you're also constantly bombarded with everyone else's curated life highlights. Instagram becomes this weird torture device. Everyone else seems to have their shit together while you're over here reading Sartre in your pajamas for the third day straight. The comparison game is brutal when you're already feeling lost. But then you also find these weird communities online. Philosophy memes, existentialist Twitter, subreddits dedicated to discussing consciousness and free will. Suddenly, you realize you're not alone in this crisis, which is both comforting and somehow more terrifying. There's also the information overload aspect. Previous generations might have had their existential crisis with limited philosophical resources. You have access to every philosophical text ever written, every lecture ever recorded, every interpretation ever published. It's overwhelming in a way that can actually make the crisis worse. The family dynamics. Your parents are confused. They're proud that you're reading and thinking deeply, but they're also worried because you've stopped talking about practical things like career plans and instead want to discuss whether objective morality exists. Family dinners become minefields. Your dad asks about your major, and you launch into a rant about how educational institutions are just tools for social reproduction, and how grades are meaningless constructs. Your mom suggests you call your high school friends, and you explain that most social relationships are just mutual self-deception to avoid confronting the fundamental loneliness of existence. They start suggesting therapy, which honestly might not be a bad idea, but you resist because you're convinced this is just what intellectual awakening looks like. You're not depressed, you're just more aware of reality than everyone else. Spoiler alert, you might actually be a little depressed. The practical problems. Here's what nobody tells you about having an existential crisis. Life keeps happening around you. Bills still need to be paid, assignments still need to be completed,
social obligations still exist. But when you're genuinely questioning whether anything matters, it becomes almost impossible to care about practical concerns. Why clean your room when entropy means everything tends toward disorder anyway? Why do homework when education is just societal conditioning? Why maintain relationships when other people can never truly understand your inner experience? This creates this feedback loop where your life starts falling apart in small ways, which then reinforces your belief that nothing matters, which makes you care even less about practical things, and so on. You become that person who's incredibly articulate about complex philosophical concepts, but can't remember to pay their phone bill. You can discuss the implications of determinism for hours, but you can't decide what to major in.
The gradual resolution. Here's the thing, though. Most people eventually come out of this phase, not because they find definitive answers to the big questions, but because they learn to live with uncertainty. You start to realize that meaning doesn't have to be cosmic or absolute to be real. Maybe the point isn't to solve the puzzle of existence, but to engage with it authentically. You can acknowledge that life might be fundamentally absurd while still finding joy in small things. The philosophers who got you into this mess actually have some solutions too. Camus tells you to imagine Sisyphus happy. Nietzsche talks about creating your own values. Sartre emphasizes that you're condemned to be free, which sounds terrifying but is actually liberating once you accept it. You start to understand that the existential crisis isn't a problem to be solved, but a stage of development to be experienced. It's like philosophical puberty, awkward, painful, but ultimately necessary for becoming a more authentic person.
The aftermath. Eventually, you'll look back on this phase with the mixture of embarrassment and fondness. Yes, you were probably pretty insufferable for a while there. Yes, you definitely took yourself way too seriously. But you were also brave enough to ask the big questions when most people your age were just going through the motions. The black clothes get replaced with colors again. You still think about existential stuff, but it doesn't dominate every waking moment. You learn to appreciate both deep philosophical conversations and mindless small talk. You realize that questioning everything is important, but so is just living. Some of the books stay with you forever. You might not read Nietzsche every day anymore, but those ideas become part of how you see the world. The crisis passes, but the intellectual growth remains. And honestly, when you meet other people who are going through their own existential crisis phase, you recognize it immediately. You become that older, wiser person who can say, "Yeah, I went through that too," without being condescending about it. Eventually, you'll look back on this phase with a mixture of embarrassment and fondness. Yes, you were probably pretty insufferable for a while there. Yes, you definitely took yourself way too seriously. But you were also brave enough to ask the big questions when most people your age were just going through the motions. The black clothes get replaced with colors again. You still think about existential stuff, but it doesn't dominate every waking moment. You learn to appreciate both deep philosophical conversations and mindless small talk. You realize that questioning everything is important, but so is just living. Some of the books stay with you forever. You might not read Nietzsche every day anymore, but those ideas become part of how you see the world. The crisis passes, but the intellectual growth remains. And honestly, when you meet other people who are going through their own existential crisis phase, you recognize it immediately. You become that older, wiser person who can say, "Yeah, I went through that too," without being condescending about it. So, if you're currently living the starter pack, here's what I want you to know. It's okay. You're not broken, you're not alone, and this phase won't last forever. Keep asking the big questions, but don't forget to eat vegetables and call your mom occasionally. And if you're past this phase but recognize your former self in this description, welcome to the club. We survived philosophical adolescence, and we're probably better people for having gone through it. Either way, thanks for watching. If this resonated with you, you know what to do. And if you want more deep dives into the weird intersection of psychology, philosophy, and internet culture, well, maybe stick around.
Until next time, keep questioning everything, but not so much that you forget to live.